Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science, where we explore the profound questions that shape our understanding of nature. In this episode, joining me is John Tregoning, a leading expert in infectious diseases, professor at Imperial College London, and author of the books Live Forever and Infectious. John's work focuses on how our immune systems fight off disease and how scientific advances can help us live not just longer but healthier lives. In this episode, we break down the science behind aging and talk about the growing role of vaccines, lifestyle, and cutting edge technologies like AI, gene editing, and immunotherapy in transforming how we think about health. We also touch on some big picture questions like what are the ethical and social implications of radically extended lifespans, and what can we do right now to stack the odds in our favor for a longer, more vibrant life. With that, let's jump in. Hi, John. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so in general, there is like a lot of misinformation, confusion about longevity or the topics on health. So let's base our discussion on scientific method and try and understand and then explain how an information becomes a scientific fact.
Yes, no, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Looking forward to talking about it.
So let's start with that. So how basically, let's say if we want to talk about, or maybe you can take your example, right? I mean, you did some experiments. You try and figure out like how certain things can work in terms of health and longevity. But how much of it is like scientific fact, and how much is you can say like more of an experimental part, right?
Yeah, so I think so when I was writing Live Forever, my second book, I did do some what I called experiments on myself. And I suppose in a very broad sense, they are experiments because you're trying something and you're changing something, but they're not scientific experiments. For it to be scientific, I would have needed to have replication. I'd have needed to have a proper hypothesis. You only need to control it properly. So they're much more illustrative than actually kind of what I'd call true science or lab science.
I mean, you can also give the example of, for example, a vaccine, right? I mean, when does a vaccine becomes so trustable in a way, right? Like when can we say that, okay, this is the final product that we have and we can trust it?
Yeah, so vaccines go through a very rigorous process of testing. So they start in preclinical studies. So that will be in like an animal model where they'll look for whether they make an immune response, whether they're safe in the animals, whether they're toxic. And so before they ever even get into a person, they have been tested, they've been demonstrated that they're effective and they can prevent the illness. They then go into like a small safety study. These are called phase 1 safety studies. These can be somewhere between, say, 20 and 100 people. And it's looking for very, very large safety signals. So there are some things that will fail in phase 1 because the safety, it's clear that they're not safe. But many things will go through phase 1. And that's reassuring. That's basically saying, okay, we've got enough evidence. We've taken this new product and we've put it into people, and we don't think it's going to be immediately reactogenic. We don't think it's going to be cause disease. And there are lots of ways you can read out. You can look for, so people do surveys when they're under these studies. They say, oh, I felt a sore arm, I felt sick. But there's also like physical ways of measuring things like temperature and other ways. So that's, if it gets through the phase 1 safety study, it will then move into like a phase 2 or a phase 3 study, phase 2 and phase 3. And that's really, instead of, as well as looking at the safety, they're also looking at the efficacy. So does the vaccine protect you against infection? So if we, or disease. So if we take the COVID vaccine as an example, the phase 3 efficacy study, the readout was, do people have respiratory symptoms? And if they do they have the coronavirus? So you can measure the specific thing you're looking for and say, the group in this arm of the study didn't get the coronavirus, whereas the group in this arm of the study did, and therefore we can say the vaccine is protective. So that we've now got measures of safety and protection or efficacy, which is so we've shown the vaccine works, that it's safe. But even at that stage, and so that is the stage where it starts being licensed. And so you get that information, say, 50 to 100,000 people. And the regulators, different countries have different things. So the UK, we have the MHRA. We'll look at that data, a dossier of all of that information, and say, okay, now we think this is safe to roll out. It's also not only safe, but it's also going to do the thing that we think it's going to do. The next step from that is then the wider rollout. And at that point, people start getting the vaccines. If you remember, during the corona pandemic, it was kind of December of 2020 that the vaccine started being given to more people. And the thing you have to remember is that human beings are very heterogeneous. There's a massive diversity of our genes, our environment, what we've seen before, and people respond differently to different things. And this will be the case for anything. So the example I like to give, recently there was a study where they looked at children who'd got acutely sick having drunk like a slushy, like a freeze drink. 20 children had to be hospitalized having drunk these slushy drinks. And it's hard to imagine anything more kind of innocuous than frozen water with a bit of syrup in it. And yet that can make people very sick. If you start using a complex biological substance like a vaccine, it may be that some people it will affect in different ways, and some people will get sick. And that is why we have these vaccine reporting systems where people can record, they're called phase 4 trials, where people record what has happened, if there are adverse events. The regulators then look and say, is this linked to the vaccine or is it coincidental? So if you have a vaccine, but then you get hit by a bus, obviously that's a bad outcome, but that's not the vaccine related. But if you have a vaccine and say there is things that is a plausible link, then that will start be looking for. And maybe the recommendations will change for the groups. Different people might need different treatment. And I think that's it's a rolling process. Just to finish on the safe, or sort of finish this final kind of thought on the safety side of things. One element is that nothing is without risk. Nothing we do in our lives is without risk. Sitting here is not without risk. Going out into the street to try and avoid getting hit by the bus is not without risk. And what vaccines are offering us is a balance of risks. So a vaccine may make a certain proportion of people, 1 in a million people, it may give them transient acute symptoms of disease or maybe something longer. But if the infection that you're trying to treat is killing 1 in 100 people, that balance of risk would say to me, you're better having the vaccine than chancing your arm with the infection.
Yeah, that's great, and it's really important that people understand, how the whole process of scientific method works, because then we can enter into the whole thing of or the whole discussion about longevity part, right? But again, like if people are following something, some experiment, some observation, they have to have this kind of understanding that how rigorously that particular whatever the message is tested, right? So let's get into the longevity part, but before that, let's try and understand what is aging. Do we have a sort of scientific understanding of aging?
To be honest, no. There are some signs, hallmarks of aging. So and these include things like the stem cells in your body aren't making as many copies of yourself. So stem cells are the ones that can change into different things. Our skin is a good example of this. If you imagine like an elevator or an escalator, at the bottom of the escalator are the stem cells. They produce copies of themselves, and that repopulates your skin. So every time you kind of scratch yourself or skin cells fall off, new skin cells will be replaced from the bottom upwards. Over time, your ability to make more of the skin cells decreases, and your skin becomes more frail, becomes more damageable. And that is happening not just in your skin, but in your bones and in your muscles and in your guts. And so all of your systems are slowly losing the ability to repair and replace themselves. The question why it happens is hotly debated. I think it's possibly a kind of side effect of evolution. One of my friends and colleagues said it's a bit like if you imagine running a bath. You need to fill it as fast as possible, and this is what's happening when we're young. All systems are go, but it gets to a point where it starts overflowing and flooding the bathroom. But as long as the bath, and when we're young and able to reproduce, then actually our system's working really well at that perfect moment. In our 20s, it doesn't matter so much what happens in our 40s, our 60s, our 80s.
So, in other words, if we see wrinkles and decreased energy, that's a sign of aging, right?
Exactly, and it's the price that we pay for being fit and healthy in our youth.
Yeah. Let's, I mean, if we want to, talk about aging, which is of course over time, but this is, this also requires an understanding of difference between health span and lifespan, right? I mean, living till 100, but most of the time bedridden, or you want to be active, right? That's also a crucial difference between health span and lifespan, right?
Yeah, and I think it's a really nice idea separating these two kind of ideas that it's not just about flying around the sun more and more times. It's about the quality of your life that you're doing it. It definitely be it certainly to my perspective. I'd rather have 75 healthy years than 60 healthy years and 40 unhealthy years. I think that that it would concentrate my energy on making sure I'm healthier for longer rather than just living longer.
Yeah, let's a little bit elaborate on that part. So you start your first book by saying that nature wants you dead, right? And you start your second book with by saying time wants you dead. So how do you distinguish? Or it was just an attempt to sort of stick with the more successful primer of the book.
I mean, a lot of it is just about keeping the theme, keeping the idea. But I think that if the thing that runs through the two books is, well, there's two bits to it. One is the inevitability of death. We are going to die, and I think that should shape our thinking about a whole range of things about how we approach our lives, not just kind of the health wise, but the kind of how we live our lives. But the second thing is that both books are really talking about the massive advances and changes that medicine has made in the last 100 years. If we look at, if we're having this conversation in 1925, our life expectancy would be considerably shorter. I would like have 20 years left to live. And that change has come about through vaccines and clean water and statins and preventative medicine and our understanding of how our bodies work at a kind of big population level has increased everyone's lifespan.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned also that there are two books that you have written. First one is Infectious, um, which you had written during the pandemic. It's more about vaccines, but not only vaccines, also drugs, other pathogens, etc. And then the second one is Live Forever, which is more about longevity and stuff. Is there also a third part to it? Like,
Yeah, I hope so. So I think in the first book I was looking at death by infectious disease.
yeah,
The second one I was looking at death by kind of non-communicable disease, natural
yeah,
causes. And I think the third one I want to talk about is more like traumatic death, the kind of all of the other things that kind of kill you. And the kind of the strap line I'm guessing for that one is probably going to be humanity wants you dead. So then I've
yeah.
kind of got a trilogy, the death trilogy, where I'm covering all the different ways that you can die.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with at least the information that you have already published, which is talking about diseases, right? So why does nature wants us dead?
Yeah, I mean, and I have to step back a bit. That's really kind of the phrase is catchy, but it is very kind of anthropomorphizing.
Yeah,
That, nature doesn't want anything. Things are just in competition for resources, and so the parasites and the pathogens that infect us, they their whole life cycle depends on getting into our bodies, stealing the kind of resources from our cells and making copies of themselves. And so it's a battle between our bodies and the outside world. There is a huge array of microorganisms everywhere. So if you look at your skin, if you look on the mouse that I'm using to have this conversation, if you kind of condense the air you breathe in, all around you there are microorganisms that would, if given the chance, take over your cells, steal the sugar from your blood, and all of these different things. So those things are out there, and our bodies have evolved to a certain extent to protect us from those things. But modern medicine gives us a foot up in the kind of fight against the pathogens.
Yeah, and let's just also think about, for example, if we have two siblings, okay, one develops diabetes and and other doesn't, right? That means already there are factors which are um, playing a role here. It's genetics, environment, etc. So let's elaborate on this part. How does these different factors they play a role in longevity?
Yeah, so the phrase I like is that the genetics loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. So we are a product of the genes and the environment, and the that will shape what happens to our lives. And so it may be that, in your example, if you're twins, it may be that what they both have the genes that predispose you to diabetes, but the environmental trigger happened to one of them and not the other. And so the one who has had that environmental trigger and who develops and starts to live with diabetes, if that's not controlled, their lifespan will be shorter, their health span will be shorter, because the diabetes affects the regulation of glucose. That changes the way that your capillaries work. It changes the blood flow in the body, and it leads to a range of bad outcomes, accelerating death. So there can be little triggers that kind of branching paths between how we live our lives.
And there, in your case at least, that you sort of sequenced your genome to try and understand what sort of predispositions you have. So, are these tools available to anyone?
Yeah, so I used a commercially available, or sorry, direct to consumer sequencing company, and they didn't, it wasn't, there are different ways of reading the human genome. So the human genome is the nucleotides, the letters in each cell, the kind of lending library that instructs your cells what to make and when to make it. And you can measure everything. That's very expensive to read every single letter in the library. But you can also essentially look at the spines of the books in the library and do a quicker scan and say, oh, and he's got this edition of this book and he's got this edition of this book. And those editions of the book, and we call them single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs, they are linked and they're associated with risks of diseases. So if you have a certain SNP, a good example is the BRCA2 gene. So BRCA2 is associated, certain mutations in BRCA2 are associated with breast cancer. So if you have that mutation, you may be more likely to develop breast cancer. So we can look through the library and say, oh, actually, he's got this copy of this book, so the risk of this thing is more likely to happen. And these direct to consumer companies exist, and it was not, I mean, it wasn't as much as say it would cost 10 years ago, but it's still sort of 150, £200 to get it done. So it's not cheap. I ultimately didn't learn very much by doing it. It told me that I have sticky earwax, which is a really important, useful fact. It said that I had green eyes, which I could have looked in the mirror. So there were some things that I didn't. It was fun. It wasn't informative and didn't particularly change how I feel about what I was going to do to kind of extend my life.
And that also explains why we cannot just rely on genetic information, right? Generally, when I talk to other scientists, especially cellular biologists, we use this analogy of software and hardware. This so thinking of life at cellular level, where basically there is something which will be, simply the biomolecules, uh, DNA, RNA, proteins, sugar, lipids, etc. That they build the whole hardware part, but then there is something more, which is the software part. We don't really have good understanding of that part, that bit yet, but that bit is equally important, right?
Yeah, and I think so. I'm increasingly saying that if you think you understand biology, you don't understand biology. It's so complicated. My one of my colleagues, Rachel Edgar, has published a paper looking at the behavior of water in different parts of the cell at different times of the day, and the water behaves differently in different places. So if we don't understand how water works, how can we completely understand how the proteins work, how the lipids, how the nanotubules work? There's so much going on in the cell. You'll have the same thing when you think about a cell. You can think about it as the kind of classical fried egg, the circle on the outside, the cytoplasm, then the nucleus. But there is traffic going everywhere. They like, how do viruses self-assemble? Like, how do they use the structure of the cell just to pull themselves apart and pull together? It is, and that's just one cell. Then that one cell forms tissues, organs, talks to each other, communicates to the outside world. It is brilliantly and wonderfully complicated, but we are a long way from understanding it.
And do you have an idea why would it be like? Are we approaching it in more simpler way? Are we thinking it more like a Newtonian kind of physics sense? Uh,
Just think there's an awful lot of information. I think there's just so much to
Correct.
peel back. I think we have a level. It's the onion skin model. Each time you peel off a layer, there's another layer of understanding. It's a bit like when they were discovering all those subatomic particles. It just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So I don't think we're approaching it in the wrong way. I just think it's a difficult problem, and I don't. That's not a bad thing, or to say that we're not making progress. It's just to say there is more progress to come, and it needs to be celebrated. It needs to be explored. People need to understand that it does take money, and research investment. We're talking at a time when research investment feels very threatened, but investing in research, governments investing in research, for every dollar they put in, they get $1.20 back out again because we understand things. But you can't necessarily target it. The your GFP is a great example of this. So this green fluorescent protein was we use it all the time. Everyone uses it a lot to do markers to understand how things move around cells. But it came because somebody was interested in jellyfish and why they glowed, and you wouldn't be able to link GFP to cancer treatments in a million years if you hadn't thought, oh well, I wonder why this guy's looking at jellyfish. So there needs to be a rich and diverse science ecosystem to generate these ideas. You can't corral it down certain paths, in my opinion.
yeah. So another complicated system that we have, if we just continue the discussion along the same lines, is the immune system, right? And I feel, and especially during reading like your first book, I was feeling like immune system has its own mind in a way, right?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on this?
I like to argue that the immune system is as complicated as the human brain. It's certainly got as many cells. It's around the whole body. It's not just trapped in one bit of it, and it's it is really complicated. And I think one of the challenges I often find is that explaining the immune system I find difficult because there's almost too much assumed knowledge in my head. I was like, well, of course everyone knows what an antibody or a T cell. The language of my day is such that explaining that to somebody else who's not using that all the time, it's like a different language. So it is. I need to step back and say this is how it works. It recognizes self from not self. These are the steps by which it does it. This is how it's regulated, and explaining how all that fits together and all the diversity that you need to make it all work. Yeah, requires some effort to kind of do it well.
And it's very important to also understand that immune system, of course, it helps us to sort of prevent all the infections, etc. But also it can backfire, right? So let's talk about this bit, like how, for example, it can help us to fight, like a virus or a bacterial infection. But on the other hand, it can also backfire in terms of longevity and aging.
Yeah, so and it has the so if we take the simple view that the immune system exists to recognize self from non-self. So it's basically saying this cell is human, this cell is a bacteria. I will not attack the human cell, I will attack the bacterial cell. And so that's quite simple. But then the bacteria start evolving. They develop ways to look more like the human cell. So now the immune system is like, well, I think this is a human cell and I think this is a bacterial cell, but I'll attack them both just to be sure. And so then it's going to be attacking the bacteria, which is great, killing the bacteria, but it's actually might be beginning to damage your body at the same time. And we call those kind of reactions autoimmune reactions. And they are very common. Lots of people live with some form of autoimmune condition. They're more common in women than men. And it's where the kind of immune system has kind of taken a wrong turn. So what is important coming out of the back of that is like when people talk about immune boosting, it's not necessarily beneficial. You don't want a supercharged immune system because if it does that, you might then start attacking yourself. You want a well-regulated immune system that is be able to discern between yourself and the kind of things that are trying to invade you.
Distinction between self and non-self. That's why I call it a mind, not a brain, because that's also something mind does, right? And but still, the point being, how does it manage to fight a bacteria or a virus?
Yeah, so there are kind of two tiers to the immune system. We call them the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. The innate immune system is looking for like really broad characteristics of invading bacteria and viruses. So there are certain chemicals that a bacteria makes that a human cell will never make, and so the innate system will see those and say, "Well, this is definitely not me, and therefore I can attack it." And it does that by recruiting other cells to the site of the infection. So it brings in the cells they're called macrophages and neutrophils. Their main purpose is to basically eat up bacteria. So they're a bit like Pac-Man. They kind of chew up the bacteria as they're going along. And you have lots of these cells. So if you've ever, had an infection or a splinter in your hand, and you notice the white debris around the splinter, most of that is the white blood cells that have come along, eaten the bacteria, and then died at the site. So that's the kind of innate system, and that is very effective. If you don't have an innate immune system, you'll definitely pass away from infection very quickly. But we also have an adaptive immune system, and this is the one that gets trained over time. So the innate system stays more or less constant. The adaptive system gets better at recognizing things that you've seen before. So a really interesting example of that is during COVID pandemic. So they were doing studies called human infectious challenge studies, where they deliberately infect people with a virus to understand the immune response. It's all very, they're volunteers. It's all very carefully controlled. There are drugs, there's doctors. It's all done in a very safe way. And what they observed was that people who'd never been infected with COVID could be infected with 10 virus particles. 10 is a very, very small amount of virus. It's kind of unimaginably small. You could fit it into like a full stop on a Word document 1,000 times. If they did the same study with the same virus, but now in people who'd been immunized or previously infected, they had to use 50,000 viruses. So 4 logs more virus. And so that's what the immune system does. Your adaptive immune system does. It gives you shielding against things you've seen before. That means we're not getting a flu today and in 2 weeks' time and in 4 weeks' time and in 6 weeks' time. It gives us protection against future infections.
Even though we are full of microbes, on our skin, in our body, etc., right?
Yeah, that's the really interesting interface, is that we have other infections that are, when they're in the right place, or sorry, not infections, but bacteria, when they're in the right place, are fine and your body can ignore them. But so if you we have our guts are full of bacteria. They help us live. They digest our food and they produce bile salts. If you take the contents of your stomach or your lower intestine and inject it into your blood, you will die very quickly because the bacteria which were fine in your stomach are now having a huge party in your blood and grow out of control, and your immune system throws everything at it to try and stop them, but probably in the process damages you as well. So context is very important about how the immune system recognizes and sees things.
What is microbiome?
The microbiome is a word for those bacteria I was just talking about. So the microbiome is the colonization of your body by normally sympathetic bacteria, ones that are not making. So at best they're doing nothing, or sorry, worse they're doing nothing, but at best they're actually helping you by protecting you against other infections or breaking food down or producing enzymes. So the microbiome is, by some estimates, there are as many cells of bacteria on and in your body as there are cells of human on or in your body. So me, John, there are 10 billion cells of John, but there's also 10 billion bacterial cells that I'm carrying at the same time. But it's a complex ecosystem. It changes all the time. So if I have too much black coffee, my gut microbiome will change. If I eat different types of bread, if I take a long haul flight and I'm jet lagged. So it's a very dynamic community that's changing all the time.
And you did an experiment to understand that microbiome, right?
I did, and this one was probably less accessible to other people, in terms of like it's not something you can necessarily do at home. So I had to work with collaborators, and so I was. There's been a lot of discussion about what effect does the gut microbiome have on our health and our well-being and our longevity, and there are people arguing for different combinations of bacteria and how they protect you. So I did three. I instead of taking one sample, I took three samples. I had a kind of baseline. I had one where I drank some beer and ate some curry, and then 10 days later, I had another one when I'd had 10 days of eating fiber and kimchi and fermented food, and I measured the bacteria on those three different time points. The difference between the first day and the second day, there was no difference at all. It basically looked the same. But then, if you measured my one after having like a lot of fiber and fermented foods, actually there was a big difference in that third one. And in some ways, the people talk about you need more diversity in your gut microbiome, and in some ways, my gut microbiome had shrunk and become less diverse, leading me to argue that drinking beer and eating curry is much better for you than eating kimchi and fiber. But I'm not sure that's actually the true conclusion. I think the main thing is it is really complex and it changes quite easily.
And it's also quite interesting that it's only bacteria so far that we have at least discovered, right, in the body.
Yeah, people, I mean, this is dependent on the way that we read the bacteria. So there are these kind of sequencing approaches. So, like I was talking about the measuring the genes in the human body, you can sequence them, you can read the libraries. You can read the libraries of the bacteria with a certain platform. But if you look closer, you can also find bacteriophages, which are viruses that infect bacteria. You can find fungus, you can find viruses. So there's a whole range of other kind of uh, microorganism environments in no ecosystems in our body.
Oh, okay. I didn't know about that. I thought it's only bacteria so far.
No. People are doing the fungome and the virome and all anything you can think of and put the word "ome" afterwards. People will try.
Yeah, so even though, let's say, our immune system makes us, live in even in this environment full of bacteria and microbes, right? And it helps us to stay healthy. But on the other hand, we also have this good relations with some of the microbes, right? But let's say that if we survive from these microbial infections, there are other sort of states where the health is important, and it can really affect our longevity, right? Starting with cardiovascular disease. So let's say that we know a person which is very healthy and all of a sudden gets a heart attack or something, right? So what does happen, and how people can take care of this thing?
Yeah, there's sort of two elements to that. So a lot of the way we think about medicine and human biology is based on big cohorts of people. So, the science is better when you repeat it lots of times, and the more times you repeat stuff, the better. But that it is only ever going to be predictive. So we can say that if you do this certain thing, so say we talk about smoking, you could say if you smoke cigarettes, there's a 90% chance you get lung cancer. But that means 10% of people won't get lung cancer. And this is where people are always like, oh, yeah, I know my great auntie, she smoked till she was 120 and she seemed absolutely fine. But for every one great auntie, there are now 99 other people who've died of lung cancer on the way. And what we can't do is we can't predict who is going to be that one person. You can just say, again, it's coming back to this idea of risk again. Like we talked about with vaccines, everything you do has risk. And yes, you might be the one lucky person who can smoke and drink till they're 120, but you are much more likely to get sick and die from it. And so with heart disease, there are different ways of the heart going wrong. It may be that the heart is just a muscle that's pumping all the time, and it's quite a hungry muscle, so it needs blood and it needs sugar and oxygen to keep going. And if that supply of blood and sugars stops, then the heart stops and the person dies. And that's the kind of most common way, this kind of acute cardiac failure. We call them heart attacks. But you can also have heart failure where the heart is getting some of what it needs, but not enough, and it just slowly gets weaker and weaker and stops pumping as well. So those are kind of two of the big ways. The third one is that in order to pump, the heart has a thing called the pacemaker, which is a kind of like an electric clock at the start of the heart that fires the electricity through the heart, causing it to contract and to beat. And so you need that to work properly, and it needs to pump in order. It needs to fill up at the top and then empty that into the big chambers and empty out. If that gets out of sequence, then that can cause damage as well. So they're the kind of three main ways in which people's hearts can stop or slow down from working.
And how they can measure it? Are there like metrics? Can they go to doctors, their GPs?
Yeah. I mean, the simplest way is just to count your heart rate. So it's to measure how many beats per minute, and it should be somewhere in healthy adults, somewhere between kind of 50 and 70. And so if it's very, very high or very, very low, it's worth speaking to a doctor about it. So that's the simple thing. And then the doctors can do things like ECGs, which is to measure the electricity that runs through the heart, and that will give that gives a cardiologist a very good sense of the different bits of the heart and how they're all working. So there are things we can do ourselves, but actually probably more likely is best to go to, if you have concerns about your heart, to go to a cardiologist, to go to your GP and get them to measure it properly.
And I also had a question about the metrics part. So because I think in general it also depends on the population, right? Or your cultural sort of or place, like from where you come and what kind of lifestyle you have, etc., right? Does it matter? Because the range of the metrics, can it change?
Yeah, so different populations will have different kind of healthy levels, and that, like you said, that will be determined by genes, often by environment. So people living in a certain place may be more genetically similar, but they may also share risk behaviors. They may share foods. They may share environmental exposure. So it will be different in different places. And one thing that is worth bearing in mind is that often medicine has been focused on white males. And so it may be that and so women may have different rates. It may be that people with darker skin may have different rates. The one with the darker skin, one really interesting thing is there's a thing called the pulse oximeter, which can measure heartbeat through your skin, but it's less good when the skin is more pigmented. It's less sensitive, and so things don't get picked up in the same way. So there does need to be a kind of bit of a resetting of like the baseline information that we take about the human population.
Yeah, or we need just more data on some of the other populations, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And what about, since you mentioned the smoking part, so what about the lung health and how do we maintain our lungs?
Yeah, the simplest thing is to try not to breathe in bad chemicals
Yeah.
regularly. So that's simple and difficult. So the the risk that many people go are under is through smoking because that contains poisons and tar and all sorts of damaging things that damage your lungs. But almost all of us are breathing in some form of air pollution, and it's better and worse depending on where you live. But there is no kind of official safe level for air pollution. So all of us are breathing in something that's doing some damage to our lungs. So it the best way you can protect yourself is to not smoke. Beyond that, doing exercise at least increases the capacity of the lungs. It means that as you get older, you've kind of got more spare capacity to give away.
Yeah, and it was also sort of crazy for me to know that, just because where you are born, it affects you so much, and how much it can really change your lifespan, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's there's kind of two elements there. If you look, that can be globally, and that will be some of that will be mixed up in terms of like exposure to infectious agents, access to healthcare, but also within countries. So in the UK, your length, your kind of longevity, your lifespan is very much tied into your wealth, to be honest. And people from richer backgrounds will live longer because they get better, they live in cleaner environments, they have more exercise, they have less stressful jobs, they probably don't work night shifts, they're not exposed to pollution. So there's lots of different factors that all overlap to mean that people from different communities will have different lifespans. And one way to visualize it, certainly in the UK, is that if you look at the London Underground map, you can start in Westminster, where the government is, and you can go east along a line called the Jubilee Line. And for every stop you go along the Jubilee Line, you lose 1 year of life expectancy as you go from west to east. And so that is often the case that people in the eastern edge of cities are less well off and live less long than the people in the west because of the wind direction. To be honest, it just blows the pollution from one side of the city to the other.
That's just crazy, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I want to discuss about this bit probably a little bit later when we discuss more about policy making. But
Mhm.
let's continue with the factors which can affect our longevity. So then the next one that we can discuss is probably the most feared disease, cancer, right? So, I mean, what is cancer, first of all, and yeah, how we can prevent it?
Yeah. So cancer is where the cells in your body start replicating without out of control. We talked earlier about stem cells and the way that your cells replace damage and kind of fix themselves with age, and that's by basically growing more copies of themselves. But that's very tightly regulated because you don't want cells to be growing where they're not allowed, where they shouldn't be growing. What happens in cancer is that some of that instructions for a cell to keep growing um, get lost, the restrictions, and it starts growing by itself. And the tumor, which is the mass of the cells that are kind of growing out of control, can cause damage either by getting somewhere where it shouldn't be. So, brain tumor is often the case is that you've got uncontrolled growth of cells in the brain and it's squashing bits of your brain that you need to think or to talk or to eat or any of the bits of brain you need. This could also happen in your stomach or in your lungs. And so the cancers may kill us because they take resources away from the bits of the body that need them, but also they prevent the function of those bits of the body as well. So that's how a cancer happens. Oh, sorry, the way that cancers kill us.
And there are also like two stages of the cancer, right? One is like more localized form, the other one would be more widespread.
Yeah, exactly. And the earlier that you can catch the cancer, the better. So if you can identify a cancer and remove the cancerous cells when it's very small and it hasn't spread, you're much more likely to survive than if you let it spread all over the body and it's kind of causing seeds all over the place.
But is there like so when it comes to, genetics, we say that there is like some people have some sort of genetic lottery, right? Is it the same when we talk about cancer?
Yeah, so exactly. So the reason why cells become cancerous is because the DNA gets damaged or changed. The instructions, that software, that encoding we talked about, it instead of saying make a copy of yourself and stop, it just says make more copies of yourself. And so that DNA damage may be more likely in some people than others. People who are more likely to get cancer lack some of the genes or have damaged copies of the genes that helps their cells repair the damage to the instructions when they become cancerous.
Since you mentioned about brain tumor, it's also sort of interesting to know that that it's not a disease with neurons, right? It's another type of cells which form cancer.
Yeah, exactly. So the brain isn't just made of neurons. There's lots of different cells in there. There's like supporting cells, and there are immune cells, and various things. And any one of those can become cancerous and can spread within the brain. You can also get an invasive brain cancer where a cell from a different bit of the body has crossed into it and then starts growing as well. So it could be anything. The brain cancer aspect is saying there is a tumor growing in your brain and that is causing some problem.
So the point being that it's not the neurons which cause the cancer, it's the other cells like glial cells, etc. But there are diseases which are related to neurons, right? Especially the neurodegeneration. Let's talk about that part as well.
Yeah, so within the brain, the most sort of important one of the most important features of our brains is that the neurons, which are the sort of nerve cells in the brain, connect and talk to one another. You have lots of cells in your brain, but more importantly, you have many orders of magnitude more connections between the reason I can speak to you about this now is because there's a connection in my brain linking memories about nerves to memories about communication, and that's firing across all the times. As we age, the amount of connectivity declines, and it's a fairly linear rate of decline. You sort of you lose that connections at a quite constant rate. You can accelerate that. So traumatic brain injury, so when people get punched in the head or playing rugby or have a car crash, that will make the connections drop down much faster. And then when you get to a certain threshold, if your brain's no longer communicating as well as it should be within itself, you get this is leading to this condition called dementia, which is where you signs of things like you begin to forget things. But dementia doesn't kill you because you're forgetting things. Dementia kills you because the bit of your brain that's saying to your heart, you need to beat now, stops telling your heart to beat, and then you die because your brain's no longer controlling the rest of your body.
Because this is also an example of the diseases brought by increased lifespan in humans, right? So in general, humans they didn't live as long as they live now, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of the zero sum nature of death. If we get better at preventing infectious diseases, we see that more people die of heart attacks. If we get good at preventing heart attacks, more people will die of dementia. That coming back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, say, death is inevitable means that if we change the most common cause, something else becomes the most common cause. It's a pie chart, and there's always got to be a bigger slice of the pie.
And even if we cure an infection, that doesn't mean it really doesn't affect us for like long term, right? There may be some changes, bits of DNA added, or some changes to the cellular machinery, right?
Yeah, and we can't. So there are definitely long-term consequences of viral or bacterial infections, and so we see a bit of this in, people may have heard of long COVID, where people had a COVID infection and then have fatigue for a long time afterwards. But there are other post-viral syndromes, sort of chronic fatigue syndrome probably has a viral trigger. Maybe even diabetes has a viral trigger. So sometimes the infections that we get lead to other conditions. And this kind of loops back to say vaccines are really important because they don't just stop you getting the infection itself, they can stop you getting the long-term consequences of it. A good example is that people who have influenza infection are twice as likely to have a heart attack for the whole year afterwards. So if you stop the severe influenza infection in the first place by having a vaccine, then you're much less likely to have a heart attack as well. So you're getting kind of double the benefits from your vaccine.
Yeah, the next factor that we can discuss is obesity and metabolic health. So I think every human on the planet likes sugar, right? And of course, I mean, how much to it, that this matters, and especially nowadays in the age of supermarkets, when we enter there is something sugary, when we exit there is something sugary, right? So how does sugar affects our health and longevity?
Yeah, so sugar is a major driver. There's two big things. Sugar can directly cause disease like diabetes, but it's more likely to drive or increase obesity. And living with obesity has a range of poor health outcomes. It can damage cardiovascular health, it will damage your lungs, it will cause diabetes. And so all of those things are driven if we have more calories in than we are expending. And sugar is such an easy, cheap form of calories that actually that probably leads us to having too many calories in, and therefore we're not balancing out. And over time, that will lead to obesity.
And what is diabetes then? Let's also explain that.
Yeah, so diabetes is a type of autoimmune condition. It's where the sort of body is attacking itself, it's preventing it from doing its own function, and it leads to the inability to remove glucose from the bloodstream. So your blood glucose should be at a fairly set level. It's called homeostasis. We basically you want it to be at a specific level because that affects everything else that runs in the body. And so if you eat a sugary snack, so if you eat a chocolate biscuit, the blood sugar will spike up for say 15 minutes. It will then the body will recognize that it's spiked, produce a protein called insulin. Insulin then makes your muscle cells and your liver cells soak up the sugar again to get it back to the normal level. In diabetes, you're less good at either producing the insulin or reacting to the insulin. And so when you have that sugary treat, the sugar stays higher in your blood for longer. And what that means is that it can then damage that sugar, that it causes an osmotic pressure. So basically the blood sugar behaves differently, the blood behaves differently to healthy blood or blood in people without diabetes. And that damages the cells, particularly in the capillaries, in the ends of fingers, the toes, and the eyes. And if those all start dying, then the tissue around them starts dying, which is why diabetes may be associated with eyesight loss because the eyes are not getting as much blood as they should be.
And how much is ultra processed food is like we can blame to?
So it's a very complicated subject. One of the things about ultra processed food is that it tends to be richer in fat and sugar and salt. And so if you draw a Venn diagram between high fat, high salt, high sugar food and ultra processed food, they often sit on top of each other. So it may be that because it gives an easy way to take, like you said in the supermarket, it's an easy way to take on sugar and fat and the things that we don't need. And that makes it easier to eat them and consume them and take them on faster. So we are taking in more calories and more fat than we should be because it's so easy and delicious to eat.
Yeah. And this also sort of brings us back to the same question, right? Like how then we can really understand if someone is healthy or not, right? I mean, if someone is maintaining a sort of healthy weight, but on the other hand, there is another person who's obese, right? So how can we really distinguish that, okay, one is sort of, it's not living a healthy life, etc. Um,
Yeah, that is really tricky. I think there are the kind of the body mass index, the BMI, is a crude way of evaluating that. It's kind of weight over height. So at least normalize it for height. But you can have people who are, very big and very muscly, and they'll have a very high BMI. You can have somebody else who's not particularly muscly and have the same BMI. And it's tricky to have a kind of absolute measurement of like what is a healthy weight. But being on the obese side is definitely more associated with risk than not being obese.
And also, it's related to most of the other diseases that we discussed, right?
Yeah, exactly. So everything is interconnected. The heart disease, diabetes, lung disease, they're all interplay. If you are have a high blood pressure, you are likely to have cardiovascular disease. You may also have lung disease. So they all interplay, and it's kind of negative cycle that each one, if as each of them get worse, you will get sicker.
And during COVID-19 pandemic, we also got to know that a lot of people, obese people, they were at high risk of high risk to infection, right? So is there like
Yeah,
a general trend about this?
Yeah, I think so. I think some diseases you can see kind of quite a clear link. So if you've got a lung disease, so if your lungs are damaged because you smoke too much, you can see that if you get a lung infection, that further reduces the quality of the lungs or affects the quality. You're going to get much sicker. So if you've been smoking, you've only got half your lung capacity. If you then get a viral infection and you lose another half of that, you're down to a very low amount of ability to take in oxygen. So that will make you sicker. Obesity is interesting in the immune context because it seems to change the inflammation. It changes the way that the body kind of sees pathogens, responds to them, and produces things. And it may be that actually it drives the body, the immune system, to run too hot, and that's dangerous. And it's that problem rather than it's not running hot enough.
What is inflammation?
Inflammation it's a quite a nebulous phrase. It's quite hard to pin it down. It kind of means uh, things that your immune system does to inform the body that there's an infection happening. So it's a release, it's movement of cells, it's release of signaling molecules, it's activation of immune cells. So there's a range of different things that we kind of sweep up into this term inflammation.
Yeah, and the other point is like how we can really sort of utilize other devices, right? I mean, for example, we can now a lot of people they are wearing smartwatches and etc., right? So how we can use this data to monitor our health and also sort of if they can really contribute in our longevity.
Yeah, so I mean, a simple thing is that the many of the smartwatches are now able to look at the way the blood flows around your body and actually can read your pulse and look for irregularities in pulse. So there are certain types of heart disease that smartwatches can detect and can say, actually, looks like your pulse has suddenly gone very odd. You might want to speak to a GP now. So I think some of that monitoring is very clever and can help you. You can, measure your amount of steps, and that helps lots of people to do the right amount of exercise or increase the amount of exercise they do every day. So doing exercises gives you across a range of different things. It reduces obesity, improves heart health, improves lung health. And if you've got a smartwatch which is saying, oh, you do 10,000 steps a day, you might be more likely to do that and therefore be more protected against some of these chronic conditions.
So it's also like a psychological friend in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And the one where I'm not so sure is on the sleeping side of things. So they're very good at measuring, or they're okay at measuring sleeping. But it may be that if you're measuring your sleeping and then worrying about the amount of sleep you get less sleep. So it might have a kind of a negative feedback loop. So it works for some people, it doesn't work for everyone.
Yeah. And another powerful tool, I mean, since we are discussing about like the tools that we can use to monitor our health and also to sort of improve it, um, another powerful tool is the gene editing by using CRISPR, right?
Mhm.
But it's also like quite sort of at the intersection of the ethical implications. Should we use it? Should we do it, etc.? What are your thoughts on it?
Uh, I, I, so I don't think it depends what aspect.
Yeah.
So if somebody's got cancer and you can take out an immune cell and gene edit it to attack the cancer cell and then put it back into the body. So if you can make, these kind of CAR T type cells, that is a set to me. That's a not unreasonable use of gene editing. What is unreasonable, unethical, unscientific is to gene edit babies because as we said, we don't know what the genes are doing. We don't know the combinations. The CRISPR is not it. It's sold as like a kind of lock and key, completely accurate, but it's not completely accurate. So you may get off-target effects, and you don't know what will happen to the offspring. So I think there will be places where engineering a gene back in. So if you are like cystic fibrosis is a good example. If you've got CF and you can re-engineer the lungs so that they're making the CFTR, the protein that prevents the disease, then that's a good use. But there is a lot of grey area and very problematic of potential from some of this gene editing.
So even like in these kind of genetic diseases like CFTR you mentioned, or sickle cell anemia, right? There is another one. Um, so in these cases, you would sort of recommend to use the tools that we have later on rather than to use genetic engineering early on.
I think so. I think engineering embryos to me would be wrong. I think selecting out, there's a difference between selecting an embryo that if you can screen at birth and say this embryo will have CF and this one won't, then that is a different argument to say this one has it and we will try and engineer it out. I think there's a difference between those two approaches.
And what are the other sort of exciting tools and the technologies being developed in this area?
I think harnessing the power of the immune system to attack cancer has been really, really exciting. So there are there are these kind of immune boosting drugs, which like anti-PD-L1. So some of the ways that cancer causes disease is because it hides and escapes from the immune system. And so if you can actually reset the clock of the immune system and get it to attack the cancer. And they've proved really, really effective in controlling cancer. So I think that's very exciting. There is much further down the pipeline. There is a family of drugs called senolytics. And what these might do is damage or remove decayed and aging cells from the body. And it may be a way to kind of clean up your body, but they are 15, 20 years away from at least from where we are at the moment.
And but what are these senolytic cells?
So one of the things that happens as you age is that your body's ability to remove dead and dying cells decreases, and so you start gathering up. It's just like if you're kind of hoarding rubbish in your bedroom. Over time, it just makes the bedroom impossible to use. So if you collect everything, and what happens when we're younger is that we're good at throwing the rubbish away, but as you get older, your ability to find the rubbish and throw it away gets less good, and that accumulates and that causes and may drive even more damage. And what senolytics do is they may reset the clock and say and tell the immune system or parts of the body that deals with rubbish to get rid of it, and that may encourage new growth, or it may kind of remove like scarring, or kind of help the stem cells reset. So I think they're an interesting idea. They are inherently toxic because they're killing cells and clearing cells away. And so getting the effect without the off-target effect is going to be very difficult. And that's where people are kind of looking at the moment.
But along the same lines, another thing is that the medications in general they increase over like by age, right? But the ability of body to get rid of these drugs afterward, that also decreases.
Yeah,
And yeah.
we have this sort of challenge. It's called polypharmacy. So people, will go onto one drug to prevent one thing. The side effects of that drug will then need a second drug and a third drug, and you get into this kind of cycle where you're taking more and more drugs to kind of keep a level keel. And drugs are, they again are designed at a kind of population level. We can say that in 70% of people, these drugs will do this thing, but we don't know again which people which. So that is tricky, and getting more. It would be a great breakthroughs to get more precision, more personalized in medicine, be able to say, based on your genome and your exposure and your risk, we think that this you should be on this treatment of drugs.
And it'll be also important to sort of understand the distinction between, lifestyle changes, then sort of relying on the medications. Of course, these are the tools, we have it, but they are not the best all the time, right?
Yeah, and prevention is always going to be better than cure. So, if you can stop drinking or smoking or do more exercise or eat better, you are going to have a better health span than if you have to get sick and then go on to Ozempic to kind of lose weight afterwards. You're better never getting obese rather than getting obese and getting thin again.
But then there are also some things which are inevitable, right? For example, the decrease in the hormones. So by age, there is decrease in hormone, for example, testosterone, etc. So when is hormonal therapy advisable? Like when people they should go for it?
Yeah, I admit this is not an area I looked enough at when I was writing the book. So, the process of perimenopause and menopause in women, so menopause is the point where women stop menstruating for over a year. Perimenopause is the lead up to that process, and that change in that perimenopausal process, women's bodies are producing less hormones, and that has a huge range of signs and symptoms and can have a very detrimental effect on women. So, understanding that better as medicine, we need to get better at doing that, getting better at identifying the actual symptoms that can be treated with the hormone therapy and how best to do that. And more research is needed in that area.
So let's go back to the prevention part then. So what are the lifestyle changes that you recommend to the people, right?
Yeah, so there's four kind of the big four, and they're ones that shouldn't be a surprise to people. So they are: don't drink, don't smoke, eat healthily, do exercise. And if you can stick to those four things, your quality of life will be better. There is one other one that I kind of came out when I was doing the research and kind of appeared in the book, and that's about social connectivity. There are two kind of strands of evidence to this. The first is that social isolation has been shown to be as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So people who are completely isolated get sicker faster. The stress of living on your own is very, very bad for you. The other flip side of that is that people who are socially connected live much longer. There's a good study called the Harvard Longevity Study, and the people who lived the longest and they're healthiest in that study were the best socially interconnected. So my kind of biggest piece of advice is to do things that combines these elements. Dancing is a really nice example of this because it's cognitive. You have to think about it, and that helps your brain. You have to do exercise, and then you're socially connected. So things that combine these things, find the things that you enjoy, and do more of the things that you like with people you love, and actually that gives you an increased quality and quantity of life.
And 21st century brings its own challenges, even in that area, right? Social media is one example. I mean, of course, it's because of those tools we can sort of connect now and we can have this conversation. But also, if people they build that social bubble, how much that affects in like for longevity and health.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we know. I don't think certainly there's no substitute for physical contact with other people. That releases oxytocin, that makes you feel better, makes you feel less stressed. So there has to be a in-person element to the social contact, but it doesn't mean that staying in touch with people through the internet is a bad thing. It's just, I think, my father always says it's good to break the bread with people every so often. You need that bit to build the network that you can then feed back in your kind of social connectivity. So yes, it's a good way of staying in touch with people when you're apart, but you do need people to people contact.
So you mean there is no hope for augmented reality and stuff like that?
Oh, I don't know. No, I don't think so. I mean, if you think, who knows? Maybe in the future. But I find I'm a very keen video gamer, and playing that online, I don't play with other people, but that's never going to be the same as being with people. And it actually is probably more stressful in some ways.
Okay. It could also be because we are old, and that's why we are thinking like this, right?
Yeah,
Maybe the new studies would tell something else, right?
yeah, maybe. But we've only had computers for 50 years, and we've evolved for 300 million.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
they're unlikely to reset quite a lot of stuff that's going on underneath.
yeah. Jokes apart, so then it also brings an important element, which is the psychology bit, right? How we maintain in general our lifestyle, because it's easier to do a diet for, I don't know, for a week, which you also tried, right? But doing it for a year or for like even longer, it's problematic. Same thing goes with the exercise, or other things, right? Maintaining your stress levels and stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit, horses for courses. You need to find the stuff that works for you. I tried a ultra low calorie diet. It was effective insofar as I lost weight, but I wouldn't be able to comply with that for over a long period of time. I was unhappy for the whole time I did it. And so for me, I know that in order to manage my weight, rather than controlling the amount of food I have in, I have to control the amount of exercise I do out. So that's my personal choice and the way I deal with it. And different people have different things. Some people can do 5-2 or intermittent fasting or calorie counting, and you have to kind of find out what works for you, and that may need help from other people. It may need advice from a GP or medication. There are different things for different people. It is a very, very tricky area, and it's the simple fact of eat less than you need the energy for. It's easy to say, but it doesn't cover any of the kind of psychosocial elements of it.
And also, I mean, because until unless you really measure it, you cannot really understand like how much energy you spend during exercise, how much you ate it, and it's also this kind of dynamic, right?
Yeah, yeah. And some days you'll do more, some days you'll do less. I think you're right to say look at it over a year. Don't look at it in like what you did in January when you had your New Year's resolutions and you're still feeling like the year was new.
Yeah. But the other thing is the stress factors, because they are, I mean, you can have the best of everything else, but if you are just stressing about it, like for example, I don't know, like you are exercising every day and you are eating well every day, but if you're stressing about it, like, oh, I have to do the exercise or I have to eat well today, etc., that also sort of can have bad implications, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think the this balance of it it's a holistic thing. Our bodies are complicated, and you can't just think about if I eat more blueberries, I will suddenly be fitter. You have to take it in the round and look at more bits of it than just saying one thing or the other. And yes, not being stress is very can be very damaging. Stress is good in short bursts. We need it fight or flight sometimes to do things, but actually in a long period of time, it does damage our bodies, it influences our immune system, it causes all sorts of things that we don't want to happen.
And here, policy making also becomes quite important because, for example, let's say the way we have traffic rules, that will drive on one side of the road, not both the sides, except if you are in south part of Asia, I would say. Uh, um, so like for example, having a lot of this sugary products or ultra processed food, and also like quite cheap in the supermarket, right? um, do you think that we need like sort of policy interventions also in this area?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think nudging behavior is a way to achieve it. I think increasing prices of some things, decreasing prices of healthier things is a good way of approaching it. But other people who are maybe more kind of this I did, but this is quite political. I'm left-leaning academic. Other people who are kind of more libertarian say, no, it should be different. It should be that people have the right to choose, and that's more important than kind of controlling the way they behave. So I'm broadly in favor of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only way to make the system work.
Yeah. The other way is, of course, like you make cultural changes. Like here in many countries in Europe, we can see that a lot of people they bike to work. That's already like a sort of it's a cultural thing, and it's simply, I mean, even the foreigners when they come to the country, I mean, they adopt that sort of lifestyle, right? So this is one way to do it. The second is somewhere we if we bring policies into it. Of course, there are like global issues, bigger issues like, as you mentioned, something about pollution, right? Could be also sound, noise, or even the work culture, etc. These are like, of course, the other factors, but apart from that, some of these factors which can be sort of changed at social level, right?
Yeah, and I think it's an important way to do it. If we think about smoking, we've gone from in the UK where 80% of men smoked in 1945 because they got given free cigarettes in their ration packs in the war, down to 10%. And so through a combination of legislation and social factors, and all of these things need to work together in order to reduce the risk of things that are doing us harm.
So at the end, what do you think about the ethical and societal implications of living forever?
I think it's really problematic, actually. I think you need death and renewal. Our ideas calcify. New generations will have new ideas, and it's not fair that if say our generation's the first to live forever. Well, what about our children or our grandchildren? What jobs do they take up? Where do they go? And you have issues around prisons. What does the life sentence mean? There's an awful lot of the way society is structured that depends on people dying. And that may sound a bit bleak, but I don't know. I so having something that's finite, I think, is a good thing. That it means that you enjoy what you have while you've got it, rather than kind of just if I knew I was living for 200 more years, I'd be like, well, I won't read that book today because I could read it in 100 years' time. But then, what's the point of doing anything really at that point? So no, I don't think we should live forever.
And already we know that in many countries they are facing a problem where there are many older people compared to the younger ones, and how to manage that population, right? And the jobs, the economy, etc. These are many challenges which are there.
Yeah, yeah. And you could restructure the economies. You could change it so pensions are less and people working longer. There are things to do, but it just it will need some thought.
Yeah. So to sort of sum up, I mean, if we integrate all the information, the things that we discussed today, it's good that people they try and focus on their sort of health span, right? Instead of lifespan. They work on their lifestyle, and they make changes to sort of work on the prevention part of it, right? Detect the problems early, sort of be more attentive about their health, and possibly read and listen, live forever, right?
Exactly. And I guess the only other thing in there, or two other things, is definitely, get vaccinated where you can. I think, that's a huge impact on your health span and your lifespan.
Yeah.
And then the last bit is be social, be connected, go out and do things. Don't spend your money on some health cure wellness thing. Spend your money going have a nice meal with friends, and you'll feel much better for it, and you'll probably live longer too.
Yeah. I mean, recently I had a conversation with Hugo Muskia about reason and scientific method. And their sort of understanding is that in general, people are not really gullible nowadays, that people need to trust more, right? This is the human mentality in general, that we question a lot in the systems, and we just need to trust a little bit more the scientific systems, the method and the tools that we have, and sort of we can, as you said, then we can enjoy our life even the way we want, right? Of course.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation and writing wonderful books. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.